Yeah, I was watching an interesting thing on the CBC this morning. They were talking to a scientist who does research on touch
Uh-huh.
and how we're all very touch starved right now,
Yeah.
and how that's has very consequential effects. So
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I was even wondering about my daughter. So like she goes to school and she wears a mask and she's with all these kids but everybody has to sort of keep a distance from each other all the
yeah,
time. And it seems very tight in her body. And it's like, I can feel that in the general atmosphere,
yeah,
um,
yeah,
which is quite sad.
yeah. It's having a like we're primates, so we need a lot of touch
Yeah.
constantly, and it affects the brain very profoundly. That's why we use touch as our primary metaphor for reality. So, yeah, it's yeah. So this combined with other aspects of COVID, I think, is putting a terrific strain on people's mental health and their spiritual well-being.
Hmm.
Um, so
Indeed. Yeah. 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 So what's new with you, Chris? Anything?
Not so much. No,
Much?
I've been hibernating a little bit in the early part of 2021. I've been
Hibernating.
yeah, I've been kind of abstaining from a lot of discussions. I find my tolerance. I mean, things like this. Yeah, I mean, this notwithstanding, this is a pleasure. But I mean, I find that I'm becoming increasingly resistant to looking at things in this unidimensional way through a screen. I know it's the only recourse we have right now, but I find my tolerance for it is eroding a little bit. So I've been abstaining a little bit from it, to be honest.
Yeah. So we have to find ways to connect to the real, to the
yep,
as much as possible to the really the real, and it's
we have to. I've been thinking about this. We have to exapt the touch machinery so it can now interact in a more virtual fashion, maybe more virtuous fashion as well, but at least a more virtual fashion, and thereby satisfy some of the needs of physical touch. And we know that spiritual traditions have had some success with getting people to exact their need for physical contact into other kinds of contact. And I think that's where things like via logos, as opposed to just the exchange of propositions, but the attempt to mutually come into conformity with something, can be very, very ameliorating for the distress that people are experiencing right now.
Yeah. Yeah. There's maybe a hunger for this in a
Yeah,
sense.
yeah,
And maybe this is related to our, a good segue for our topic today, because we
it
need
is.
touch, and
Yeah,
we're talking about, we talked about philia. That was our first kind of
yeah,
Reinventio discussion. And I was thinking that philia is a kind of ground in a
yeah,
sense, that we need this sort of sympathetic, good faith friendship between people. And then the Eros comes a little later when we can, when there's a kind of dynamism going on. I don't know if this is, if you would, this is just me making up stuff, right? Not actual
it's
philosophy.
playful though, and it's good to play.
And I thought about that, and then I thought that then that would afford this agape that we're talking about. On the other hand, that's kind of too hierarchical, that they're all happening at the same time.
Well,
Does that make
can
any
I make,
sense? Or
yeah, it does. But can I make a proposal? I mean,
sure.
I gave a talk on this a long time ago in the before times. And I have a proposal because I was really trying to understand a line that Suzuki talked about, and he makes a connection to D.T. Suzuki,
Mhm.
considered sort of the figurehead for the Kyoto school. And he makes a comparison between his thought and Eckhart's. And he talks about this task of transforming Eros into Agape. And I thought a lot about it. And then I tried to transpose it and hopefully explicate it, and perhaps even explain it a bit, onto some of the conceptual machinery that Chris and I have worked out. So if I could take a couple minutes, maybe I could lay
Please,
that
that'd
out,
be great.
and that
Yeah.
would give us.
Mhm.
So, I mean, I'm going to just start with something that we've argued for at length, but I'm just going to just use it as, I'm just going to presuppose it, which is this idea of the agent arena relationship, and they're co-determining, co-creating, co-identifying. And that that's happening within that process of relevance realization. Again, I'm not going to take the time to defend that because I've done that extensively. And then here's the idea, and your metaphor helps, because you were right about how Eros is often typified through the metaphor of hunger. And so I think of Eros within the agent arena relationship is how things are important to us, how we want to take them import. Eros is like hunger. And it seeks for consummation. And it's no coincidence that we use the word consummation for the completion of Eros. Eros is that how things become one with me because of how I take them into myself, how we unify in some fashion. And so this maps onto something really important. And Chris and I are going to be talking with Greg Enriquez when we do the elusive I, the nature and function of the self. So what's been happening is a lot of research showing that self-relevance, how things are relevant to you, is really fundamental glue for cognition. So I think of Eros as the affective motivational state whereby we try to enact the necessary self-relevance for our cognitive and biological existence. Mm-hmm. And then I think of philia as, right?
I'm sorry, I always say philia instead of philia. My apologies.
Maybe that's right. I don't know. I claim no authority on the pronunciation. We need an ancient Greek scholar here, whichever it is, right? But I think of it as what it clearly is. For example, for Aristotle and Plato, it's a reciprocity, and that's where I think that's where we act out transjectivity, where we act out the fact that we are in reciprocal relationship, and this is also constitutive of our biological and cognitive agency in the world. And so what I think that does is that I think philia, and this is what it seems is going on in the Suzuki Eckhart thing, philia is Janus-based. It looks both ways. Mm-hmm. It looks both ways. And and philia starts to expose us to things we've talked about here. It starts to expose us to things that transpose us from an egocentric to an ontocentric reality. It exposes us to beauty. It exposes us to the care of the other.
To horror too, right? Both we talked about that already, like those two sides.
Yes.
It exposes us to the duality, the tension, the pain even, and also the beauty.
Yes, and so those both have the capacity to unself us. And then I think of agape as the reverse. So Eros is this way, philia is like this, and then agape is this way. And that seems to be more of come from our cultural being. So when you take a look at meaning in life, one of the things, the factor that is most significant for people experiencing meaning in life is what's called mattering. They need to feel that they are making a difference to something that has an existence that's larger than them, that's independent of the egocentric concern. Of course, and the metaphor that is often used for agape, of course, is not hunger, it's not reciprocity, it's the parent-child relation, because the parent has to matter to the child, because the parent is responsible for creating, not consuming or coordinating, but creating a person from from what Greg Enriquez calls, a primate, turning a primate into a person. And so I think of them.
It's almost the opposite of my formula. Like that's almost the base, right? The parenting, and then later we move into the.
No. What I'm doing is I'm trying to pick up on your point about giving a non-hierarchical. Yeah. That's why I'm doing this horizontal thing. Right. They're all components of this, and they all meet different needs. There's the need for self-relevance. There's the need for like cooperation, the deep need, because we hunter-gatherers, right? Mm-hmm. And then there's the need, right, to matter, and I think that exacts from our relationship of, parental concern. And so we exact that in agape, we exact self-relevance in Eros, and we exact cooperation in philia. And I think we, just because it's Valentine's Day, and so I think we have misidentified, well, I don't even like the word, but it's the word we now use, romantic love with just Eros. And I think, and the research, I think will bear me out on this. A really good romantic relationship should have all three. It should have all three because all three of those needs need to be met. I think when you are in a romantic relationship, obviously there should be the satisfaction, and we can talk about what that means of Eros. There should be deep philia, deep friendship. Many people point to that as something that points to a long-standing relationship. Mm-hmm. And there should also be agape. There are times when we have to forgive other people and give and sacrifice. I don't want to be too sacrificial, but we have to sacrifice so that they can be afforded the conditions they need for the cultivation of their personhood. And I think a romantic relationship should have all three. I'm not an expert in this. I don't know if anybody is.
Nobody
But,
is.
but I do think, because I think the proportions of those shift around according to development and context. But I do want to critique the romantic idea that romantic love is equivalent to erotic love, because if that system I just argued for makes sense, you need all three, because all three of those needs are actually essential to our existence as cognitive agents, especially cultural cognitive agents. Mm-hmm. So I'm just laying that out to give us something we can use as hopefully a foil for discussion.
Yeah. Yeah. What about you, Chris? What do you have to say about romantic love? If you don't mind me asking, if that's not.
I don't know. Yeah. I don't know what I have to say about romantic love. Maybe we'll come back to it. But one of the things I'm interested in maybe talking more about, and this fits into the self-relevance dimension of what you were just talking about, John, insofar as the mechanics are concerned, is the phenomenology of the way that Eros actually presents itself, and in particular the kind of hiddenness, the darkness, if you will, in the way that Eros presents itself. Because I think that the way we experience, right? I mean, going back to the Socratic Eros as the revelation of insufficiency, the revelation of ignorance is characteristic of the experience of Eros. And so I think it is experienced in the form of suffering. And that's not to make it into something sinister or morbid, of course, but there's a kind of
that kind of gives me an insight into why mystical poetry is often very erotic, right? Because it's about this loss of something and then filling it in with the divine, or whatever they would say.
That's right. I've been reading. It's interesting you say that, Andrew. I've been reading John of the Cross recently, and The Dark Night of the Soul, and he describes this purgative process that the soul goes through as it purifies itself, as it were, and dispels itself and dissociates itself from those appetitive features of its environment, which are not sufficiently satiating for the soul. And he describes it as a kind of aridity, like a drying out of the soul. And the drying out of the soul has something to do with its erotic orientation, right? So we think of Eros as
very wet.
Yes, I was going to say, forgive the metaphor, but yes, we think of it as being something very wet. But in fact, there's a dryness to Eros because its very nature implicates it in insufficiency and in lack. And I'm interested in also maybe this idea, I think that the Neoplatonists talk about in particular, that the self-division of the soul is a kind of that Eros is the feeling of the self-division of the soul and its thirst or its hunger. I guess we can choose either metaphor for the reunification with itself, that there's somehow a negative unity or a negative non-logical identity.
There's being ripped
of the
apart,
self
right?
to itself. Yes.
And then there's
that's
also
right.
this coming together and being ripped apart simultaneously.
That's right. And so the negative unity, it's if we were talking about it with respect to God, we might call it apophatic, right? Apophatic. The negative unity of the self to itself is marked by the experience of Eros. And of course, if I understand it right, the Neoplatonists, of course, they understand that dynamic not only to be characteristic of the soul, but of course of the other hypostases as well, right? So the divine divides itself such that it can long for itself. That there is a self-division, and the erotic pains of the self-division is the longing for the becoming of oneself, whether we're talking about oneself as a particular soul, or whether we're talking about oneself as the capital O, one's self. And so you certainly know much more about that than I do, John. But I'd be interested in thinking about it in those terms as well. Like there's an ontology to this that's not just confined to the individual and our experience of Eros, but that Eros is a kind of cosmic, and at least in the Neoplatonic sense, is a kind of cosmic binding, a kind of agreement of the one self with itself that is characterized by the suffering of lack and longing, and on a human level, ignorance and hiddenness of self.
So I think that's fantastic.
Yeah, me too. Yeah.
So let's pick up on this. So the Neoplatonic, you have basically the procession and the return, and I've tried to map that onto emergence and agape. Emergence and emanation. I don't know why I said agape. Well, I do know why I said it, but I'm jumping ahead of myself. Let's try that just a little bit. Let's think about the human being. Let's bring in the Socratic, because Eros isn't right. Eros isn't just the hunger, right? And as Moore and other people have made, the Socratic self is also deeply aspirational. I'm going somewhere with this, right? I think, right, there's a sense in which, and picking up on Agnes Callard, the present self, right, is causally efficacious for the aspired self, right? And that comes out of a sense of lack, right? Mm-hmm. But the aspired self, right? The aspired self is normatively regulative of my behavior. And one of the ways I think about this is there's erotic emergence and then there's agapic emanation, right? Because agape emanates and it makes possible where Eros emerges, it bubbles forth, it erupts. We also have all the eruption language. I'm trying not to get graphic here, right? Right.
I'm very graphic in my imagery behind me, because I was thinking about that in terms of our conversation. We have the dry over here, the dryness that he's talking about, this emptying out, and then we have this dynamic sort of.
But every emergence is an emptying out, because every emergence is a leaving behind, right? And so what I'm saying, Chris, is I think what you can do is, I think all three of those dimensions are the way the self relates it to itself, right? The self is, right, it's erotically seeking wholeness. It's seeking, right? But that means it needs to internalize something that is given to it agapically from the future self, the aspired self, the more real self, right? And then, of course, you have Plato's idea that there has to be philia within the components of the self, because we're not it's not the case that we proceed and return in a monolithic fashion. We do it to varying degrees for different motives at different scope. Plato's notion of the monster, the lion, and the man. And so you have to have philia, right? And then there's Eros, and then there's agape. And again, that's why I think it's so central to any spiritual tradition, like Andrew was saying, that, right? Again, so just like I said, we shouldn't be reducing romantic love to erotic love. We shouldn't be reducing spiritual love to just agapic love. Yeah. There is all three in both. And but that doesn't make them identical, but you have to see all three dimensions in both. And so I see the Socratics, I see in Socrates, someone who has the Eros, right? He senses what he does not know, right, in a profound way, but he knows the unexamined life is not worth living. There's that which is given to him. He has his daemon that speaks to him agapically, right? And then, of course, there's the philia. He says, I know that when I go home at night, there's a man I have to face and talk to, which is himself, right? And so I'm thinking, like, we could say that, and then maybe that brings up an interesting question. If these, and they're often confused for each other too, right? Spiritual love and romantic love. And romanticism did a really nutty job on that. But both of these have those movements in them, all three, the procession, the return, and the remaining, right? Because there's the three. So
the procession, the return, the remaining. Can you elaborate?
Yeah. So the procession is the idea is Neoplatonic metaphysics is symmetrical and opposite to ours, right? So you start with unity, and then unity proceeds into differentiation. But there's also a counter movement that all the differentiated things self-organize back towards unity. So they proceed and then they return. But the idea is that, but it's not like two things. It's not like, see what my hands are doing. It's misleading. It proceeds and then it returns. But the idea is the effect, right, when it proceeds, it still always remains within its cause.
So that's the Godhead that leaves and never.
Yeah, exactly.
What is the phrase again of Meister Eckhart?
Which
about
one?
the Godhead, which leaves and never leaves at the same time. I can't remember
There's lots of where he says that,
Uh-huh.
where he's trying to indicate, and it's all through Plotinus and also Proclus and
Uh-huh.
Damascus, this idea that we have to talk about this with metaphors of movement, but we have to remember that the metaphors ultimately are misleading in an important way. Anyways, that's what I wanted to say, Chris. I think that there's this, I think when we're talking about the spiritual life, right, I think there's something like simultaneously the hunger from Eros and the nourishment from Agape, and some kind of phileic relationship between them when people, I think, consider themselves spiritually, I don't want to say fulfilled, but enriched. That's perhaps. What do you think about that as a possible way of thinking about it?
Yeah, well, I'm familiar with that argument of yours. I've always really liked it. I know it's been developing, but I've always really liked that argument, and I think in part because it binds Eros into a conditional relationship with Agape, right? Eros becomes a condition, an enabling constraint, I suppose, for Agape, and becomes part of the Agapic process. Like I think of the way in which, for instance, the Eros of Socrates, like I often think of the Socrates-Alcibiades relationship as being indicative of this, because so Socrates has a countenances Eros toward Alcibiades, and in so doing, he attracts Alcibiades' Eros in his direction. But then he abdicates the Eros, right? He steps back, he retreats away. And so Alcibiades, all of a sudden, has this objectless Eros that can't be fulfilled, and so then it becomes internalized and directed unto himself. And I think that's part of the so I think it's in some sense the purposing of Eros in the pursuit of oneself that allows for the Agapic project to be realized, because it's this desire to be known. He wants to be known by Socrates, and Socrates is unwilling to sufficiently know him. And it's we were talking at the beginning about how the yen for touch is so fundamental and is so disrupted right now. And part of the yen for touch is the yen to be known, because the more known we can be in the eyes of thou, the more known we become to ourselves, and then the more we can model ourselves, right? And model ourselves with the world. But it has to happen. Because Eros, the revelation of Eros is the revelation that we are other to ourselves. It requires the symbolic intervention of the other in order to be known to ourselves, in order for the Agapic process to be possible.
I was thinking of the movie The Matrix when you were talking, and how Neo, he's this kind of guy, and he's in his, and the only reason he'll get out of bed in the morning really is to meet Trinity, right? And Trinity will lead him to Morpheus, so there's this sort of it's the erotic pull that gets him out of his cocoon or his negativity or just dying in utero in some sense.
Well, but what I'm proposing, though, I think falls on this, is I'm proposing that there is a way in which the hunger, the space, right? It's not just that we're pulled, right? I think Eros can be properly tutored, and you see this in Dionysus, and it's also, I think, in Socrates, right? Because that can be transmuted into a receptivity, and the core trait you're trying to cultivate in Neoplatonism is a receptivity to how the one is emanating and giving to you the conditions, like a parent giving to you the conditions and the possibilities of personhood and self-transcendence, right? But if you haven't tutored your Eros, because this is metaphoric for the Neoplatonists, it's the direction of your Eros. If your Eros is directed down, Eros can be the thing that binds you so that you cannot, right? So you lose your capacity for self-transcendence, but Eros can become the thing that shapes that hunger into like a profound receptivity that allow. And the point that Neoplatonists make is ultimately the only way, I'll speak sort of semi-religiously here, the only way to relate to God, you can only receive God. right? If you try to have any other relationship to God, you are giving up God for an idol, right? And so the eros has to be, like I say, it has to be transmuted into receptivity. And in fact, that was an insight I had when I was reading Dionysius, because I kept trying to understand, what does he mean when he says we love God? And he says, look, he says there's like a seal and it's going to roll on some clay. The clay has to have the right receptivity. If it's too tough, there's no impression. That's right. That's the emanation, right, of the form, right? But if it's too watery, it doesn't take the impression. You have to get it right. And that's what it is to love God. To love God is to change the hunger for the other, by which we can self-transcend, into a receptivity. So
kind of into a substance of some kind, which is semi-permeable and dynamic and alive, rather than something cold and distant, or else something that's just drowning in itself. There's sort of a middle way there. Or
well, I'm trying to suggest that the hunger can shift from being sort of a raw consumptive desire for unity into a receptivity, so that I can thereby internalize something that I cannot make within myself. That's what I'm suggesting.
And that's also part of growth, isn't it? I mean, in a life, in a sense, because in your 20s, that's what you go through, right? You hit this narcissistic wall, right? You have all this desire, and then you get kind of destroyed by it, in a sense. You have to rebuild yourself up to understand that purpose of that is not you. It's giving. Am I making sense?
I think so. I think Chris spoke of it eloquently. I think the pain of Eros, if properly responded to, if we are responsible to the pain of Eros, it can be transmuted into a sensitivity for things we could not previously touch. It's like the people coming out of Plato's caves being blinded by the light. But I want to caution, because the Neoplatonists are also like, if one of the things you can do in the presence of such pain, and I've been sort of wrestling with this myself over the last 8 weeks or so, is you can harden the heart, right? You can harden the heart.
Yeah.
And then I think a hard heart with erotic desire becomes purely consumptive. Purely consumptive.
I know the French word endure means make hard.
Yeah.
Which is interesting.
So then the entire basis of the Socratic paideia, like the training of the Socratic eros, which becomes the anagogic eros, is precisely to tutor the sensitivity that you're describing. To transmute the appetitive forms of eros into that ontological sensitivity, such that emanation can be duly received and be made known by the very longing for it.
Yeah, so that we know as we are known, as St. Paul says.
Yeah,
that's right.
So we get to that place. Right.
It's very beautiful. How do we do that without being damaged? And how do we go through that process? It's like it's such a difficult process, it seems to me.
Yeah.
God, it's like, fuck. Excuse my language, but
I mean,
as you say, the beauty and the horror, the total negation, and then also then finding incarnation in that, and then there's just and also the more you get into it, the more subtle it becomes, and the more traps there are for your soul, in a sense.
And there's more opportunities to be heard.
Opportunities too, yes.
Right, because Chris is right. We want to know and we want to be known, and that's the basis of dialogos. Chris and I have argued that, right? And he's put it into eloquent terms. But what you mean is you allow another individual to touch you in the places that have the potential where you're most vulnerable, and that means I'm gonna deliberately play on. They know how to hurt you.
And vulnerability. Eros leads you to vulnerability. That's clear, right?
It can. I mean, like I said,
or it could lead you to this other thing you're talking
hardening, where you consume and you never recognize that the hunger is a potential to see as you have not seen and be as you have not been. Right? There's that. But I do think it's inevitable that we're going to get hurt. And that sounds like such a trite thing to say, but I think it's really important to say that. And the thing that comes to my mind as an analogy is learning a martial art, really learning and letting your body be changed. It hurts.
Mhm.
It hurts to do that. It really hurts. But if you don't go through that hurt, you don't gain the new movement. You don't gain the new sensitivity. You don't gain new ways in which the world can impress itself and leave an impression upon you. And so
that's why you need this training that you're talking about. I mean, I think that's the answer in a sense, is the right kind of training that affords that kind of vulnerability, but also strength at the same time. So it's not.
But we have a shitty history about that.
Yeah.
Right?
We do.
Christianity has a bizarre, tortured relationship with erotic love, and our current culture, with its myopic, decadent romanticism, is giving us no good guidance. I mean, there's some good literature here and there, but generally, we're impoverished in terms of where we can turn to get that training.
Well, we have this choice between kind of porn and on one hand, and then this moralism on the other.
Well, no, I said there's three. There's moralism, right? There's porn, and there's rom-coms, right? Romantic comedies, which are like, none of those are good places to turn to find the tutelage of Eros.
Yeah,
they're not good. And think about it, Chris. Think about these very profound thinkers like St. John, right? But if you wanted to go to them like, well, how do I tutor Eros? There's not much there. And when I was reading Suzuki, and he says, the primary project is to transform Eros into Agape. And I'm thinking, yeah, that's great. Where do I find, I practice a lot of Buddhist practice for decades. Where do I find that, right? Where do I find that training?
Not in the Sutrayana, but in the Vajrayana. Not in this, but in this.
Well, yeah. And
but I mean, but that's a mature thing, like, and it's a rare thing, and it's kind of happens after a lot of training and a lot of unraveling and a lot of, I think, anyway, I mean, here
you know more than I.
It's just a metaphor here, right? It's just it's just an image, and it's just an icon, and it's a longing, right? But I wonder why, like, again, that's sort of shut down in the as a sacred thing, right? How this is a sacred image to me, right? This image that I'm showing you, which I'm sharing, which I wouldn't probably put on the wall in a normal conversation, but it's not. I don't know. This sort of image is taboo in the culture. It's like we're supposed to reject that, or else it's always hidden. Maybe the word hidden and the darkness and that sort of thing that Chris was talking about, I think behind that is this.
Well, I mean, we are at our most vulnerable. I mean, this was the great insight of Orwell in 1984. People are at their most vulnerable in their sexual relationships, right? Because they are potentially going through the erotic exposure. They're definitely physically exposed, right? And so, and though that physical and psychological exposure and vulnerability means people generally want some protected privacy around, at least in our culture. I mean, we've been gifted by the chimney changed things. Before when there was a hearth, people slept in one big room, and sexuality was a little bit more prevalent. But since the invention of the chimney, and I don't think this has been a bad thing, we've thought that there should be some privacy attached to sexuality, and this can become prudish and pernicious, but because people are at their most vulnerable in those circumstances, and that's why.
Well, what I was saying, kind of thinking, is that we don't make the difference between this and porn, right? We don't consider this to be divine or see the divinity in this. We see it as porn in a sense, like.
But again, we don't have modeling of the sacred aspects of these things.
Yeah.
Right. So, and I mean, it's the agony of Eros. Yeah, Han.
The agony
right.
of Eros,
He's excellent at the critique of pornography.
That's a great title too. The agony of Eros. Wow,
yeah, the agony of Eros. And he said the agony, right? And he points to the spiritual potential of Eros and why pornography is immoral and pernicious. And I'm not trying to be prudish here, right? Let's be more careful. The potential for it being vicious, conducive to vice, is precisely because it removes that dimension, right? What I do is I completely give in to consuming, and there's no mystery or hiddenness to the object of my erotic impulse. So it becomes completely consumptive, and there's no way in which it challenges me. And that's
no art
that's
and
why,
virtuosity, to use Chris's
yep,
terminology too.
it's removed, and we replace transformation with technique, right? So it's like, oh, I don't have to undergo any significant transformation in order for this to be a good erotic encounter. What I have to do is use the right techniques that will allow me to consume as much as I can from this situation.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And you take the techniques from the tradition, but you don't take the whole gestalt of the tradition, or the whole, all the stages and.
Our culture is given to pornography in many forms. I mean, we have confirmation porn, as Leo puts it, Leo Ferraro, where we're constantly seeking confirmation, or we're just consuming. We're just consuming evidence with a hard heart, right? So that we confirm and maintain our beliefs. Right? But we also have intuition porn, in which we're just constantly wanting our intuitions, right, to be given, satisfaction. And like our culture, and I think that was Han's point, right? Is we have given into a pervasive transformation of most of our impulses into pornographic versions.
Yeah, so we don't want to just talk about sexuality when it comes to porn. It's actually just de-sacralization of all things.
Watch Margaret Stewart. They coined a phrase for her, domestic porn, because she was doing all this stuff about, your house, here's what the perfect house looks like. Here's the perfect meal. And it's right. But the point is, like, it serves the people who want to manipulate us to get us as much, to get us as much as possible into a consumptive mode. They don't want us to transform, and because if we transform, we might change and not want their crap anymore. And they want us to consume as much as possible, because that way we empower them and give them wealth. I'm not trying to make a Marxist critique here. I'm just saying that it's no coincidence that we're coming to think of ourselves not as citizens,
as commodities.
Well,
to be Marxist, I mean, Marx had a few things, right? I mean, didn't he? I mean, the commodification of
everything.
Yeah.
Like fast food is basically the pornography of food, right?
Yeah.
So I think the
where
question.
Do we go from here? Where do we go from here, Chris? Where do we go from here?
Yeah. Please, Chris.
I'm just been complaining about the pornographication of the world, if that's a word.
Good verb. I like it. Pornographication of the world.
But I was thinking, as you're talking, I was thinking of perhaps an obverse case study, or an obverse example to the. So let's talk about porn just in the sexual context for a moment, right? It's the thingness of sexuality that de-symbolizes it in the pornographic experience. In the pornographic encounter, you encounter sexuality without the symbolic, without the symbolic implicature of the erotic spirit, and that's part of what empties it of its pregnancy and empties it of the beyondward gesture that it typically otherwise has. Its transparency is removed, right? It becomes completely opaque in the pornographic encounter. There's an interesting thing that happened in Victorian sexuality, which was its combination, its accidental, I think, and quite involuntary conflation with spiritualism. Right. So the Victorians, obviously they had that was really the birth of the seance and the seance culture, right, was in the Victorian context. And they used to have these seances where they would gather around a table. There would be a channeler or a medium or whatnot. And they would they had a symbolic order for ritualizing the seance, such that the spirit would descend upon the table and flit between the people and activate and animate their own spiritual connection with themselves and between themselves. And of course, we know that the Victorians were famously or infamously host to a very sexually repressive culture and a very sexually repressive way of interacting. And there have been some interesting, I think Roger Clark did one of them, I'm sure there are others, sort of natural histories of spiritualism that have have examined how the largely repressed sexual experience was enfolded into the ritual of the seance, such that it manifested a kind of spiritual or spiritualistic interest in this self-transcendence that perhaps otherwise wouldn't have been as powered or wouldn't have had the same kind of thrust or force to it. Excuse the diction.
I'm going to keep falling into that.
So now, for some, was it completely unconscious? I imagine it was. For some, was it partly conscious? Perhaps. But as a culture, or broadly speaking, I think this was a largely unconscious conflation. And I think that's
also
one
there's
of the
something
things.
real about that too, isn't there? There's something. That's the way religion should operate in a sense. Often is that you have these carnivals where all the taboos are broken, so that you go back to your ordinary life. And
That's right. And I think in the example I've just given, it was perhaps unintentional or an accidental admixture. It was an accidental synthesis of sexuality with spirituality. But I think that what am I trying to say? The kind of the alchemical transmutation of one in virtue of another is one thing I think that we just don't have a handle on anymore.
Yes.
We don't have a handle on how to purpose and leverage the vitality and life force of the sexual impulse in service of something more broadly erotic that is manifest in a kind of spiritual exercise. It doesn't have to be Victorian spiritualism, but any kind of spiritual exercise.
But it could be gay clubs in New York, or it could be gay clubs in New York, or something like that, or like.
Wait. There's something important about the seance.
Yeah,
I think there's something important about the seance
because it's a conjuration. It's a conjuration too. It trains. Sorry, John. I just anticipating what you might be about to say. The conjuration of the seance. The conjuration of the seance is, in its own context, is a kind of training and receptivity, analogous to, if not identical to, the kind that we were talking about from the Neoplatonic vintage.
And it has features of dialogos all in it, all around it. But what else is there? Spirituality, sexuality, the seance, mortality is there.
Yeah.
Right? The death. And, when Plato talks about the deep connection between Eros and the confrontation with our mortality, right? And there's something there also, because our mortality, if you'll allow me to expand this term, is kind of our central hunger, right? Because mortality is to be in a state of continual lack. We lack the permanency, if that's the right word, of the eternal entities, right? And so we are always in that sense erotically charged towards seeking a contact because of our mortality with something beyond. I remember, when in the symposium, where the argument is made, when we are giving birth through sex to our children, that is one of our best participatory symbols of what it is to be an eternal being, right? And so I think the seance is, like you do this, like I think it was sorry, I was going to say it's pregnant, and then wow, with a lot more, right? There, obviously there's the invocation of the dialogos machinery, but there's also, right, there's those three things are actually bound together: mortality, spirituality, and sexuality.
Yeah, I also got the feeling there was something a little bit off in my conversation with John, and that we were being too moralistic about the world and not respecting like the entire fabric of things, like which sexuality is a part of.
Yes.
Even porn is a part of, and we can't just like complain about it. There's something going on there, and there's an energy, and we need to figure it out. We don't just need to say, oh, this is good or bad.
Right. And I think part of the way of connecting that is to see that Eros is more comprehensively discharged onto the world because of our mortality, and the way our mortality conforms to and participates in the fatality of all things. All things are impermanent. All things are prey, right, to being destroyed by time. and even the things we most love. 3,000 years from now, all the people that and all the people that knew the people that knew, like that will all have disappeared and gone. And you can wake up at 3 a.m. and think about that, and you can be confronted. And very often, the thing that sort of is the redemptive counter impulse to that is sort of the erotic impulse of, well, then I will make, then I will create, right?
Yeah,
something like
give
that.
Birth and beauty.
Give birth, yeah. Or I will, or what I'm also suggesting is I will seek out. You can hear Stoicism and the way it transmuted the erotic impulse. I will seek out to come, and especially Neoplatonism. I will seek out to come into unity with the eternal, right? So even in Stoicism, I stop living horizontally because that means inevitable perishing. I can only satisfy this erotic response to mortality by coming into, right, the depths, by coming into a relationship with what is eternal, which is not the same thing as the everlasting, right?
Right. And that my identity has to share in it.
Yes,
exactly. I have to participate in it. I have to right. It's a process of gnosis, right? I have to
yeah, totally.
I have to come to share its identity as a consequence of being a participant. Yeah.
I was thinking maybe that's a problem with Sutriana, or with more religion that is about renunciation. The renunciation is a necessary stage, but it's not the whole story, because as you say, we have to participate. There's a participation that is a living participation.
So if my memory is incorrect here, let me know. But are there not cultures that describe the orgasm as a little death?
Petit mort in French, yeah.
Petit mort. Yeah.
Right. So that's what I'm getting at. There's that, like, the moment when we feel the fullness of Eros is also a moment where we
They also say in France to chanter, so it's to sing.
To sing.
So it's like a petit mort, and it's also a song.
Yeah. So you're singing, but the song reveals the silence of your mortality.
Fantastic.
Like that.
So
I like that.
I mean, so we have to. We have to. Yeah, you're right, Andrew. And I didn't mean to be moralistic. I did say.
No, I think I was getting into that state of mind as well, and I think it's not quite. It doesn't get you anywhere. It's just.
No, my critique. People will consume pornography, and that's the right word, right? To varying degrees. What my critique was of the way, like I said, it's indicative of a larger push to harden us. Yeah. And that's where I think the moral critique should be directed, not towards the particular image or the particular act or something like that, because I get, like, human beings will and there's nothing wrong with this, right? They'll have sex just for fun. We do lots of things just for fun, but we don't want to be in a culture where it's so hardened that we can't recover the spiritual dimensions of sex. That's the critique I want to make.
And I think recovering the spiritual dimensions of sex have something to do with the preservation of hiddenness.
Yes.
I think. Yeah. Right. That's the preservation. I mean, one of the reasons why pornography is so de-eroticizing and de-symbolizing is precisely because it's too revealing.
Yeah,
it's too revealing.
Veils are very erotic, and
that's right. I actually had someone say to me recently. I thought this was very telling, that the presence of masks, because of COVID, being in public spaces and seeing everyone wearing masks. Someone said to me recently, it was this very erotic experience. Well, there's something very erotic about seeing everyone wearing masks, and to me that's a very significant observation, because it's somehow that even in the intimate relationship, there has to be the preservation of concealment is necessary in order to attain, paradoxically, and I think the paradox of it is important. Yeah. Preserving hiddenness is necessary for attaining the transparency required for the sensitivity that you were
Oh,
discussing.
That's amazing.
yeah.
It's an amazing point.
Right.
It's amazing because because by not seeing, you can see further. It's almost like you can have a vision by not seeing, or something. It's like you can see further by not seeing. It's like the blind poet Milton.
That's right. Oh, yeah. That's right.
If I know that you have reverence and respect for the mystery in me, then I am open to being as transparent to you as possible.
Yeah.
Right.
Because you have recognized that no matter how deeply you see into me, and of course vice versa, you will never grasp me and encompass me or consume me with your gaze. Pornography is when we believe mistakenly that we could completely consume the other in our gaze.
And we don't believe at the same time. It's like
yes, we don't.
It's a lie, basically. It's
yes. It's a form of self-deception. Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
But that reverence, that the hiddenness and the reverence, there's something, you're right, Chris. It's precisely because, it's the moreness and the suchness. It's precisely because people will always withdraw from our grasp, right? That we will always be erotically charged.
Yeah.
That's
in the tradition I keep talking about, I'm sorry to bring it up so much, but in the Dakini, for example, there's images of the Dakini, and she's naked and resplendent and on a moon, and it's incredible. But she's naked, but she's adorned at the same time. It's very interesting. So it's not just that she's naked; she's also adorned. She's also wearing symbolic representations of various things and musical instruments.
And the psychological research with that too.
Yeah.
Men, I only know I've only read the men's side. Women are different, and I don't want to.
Men too definitely are very adorned and wearing tiger.
No, but what I mean is, men find pictures of women in lingerie, for example, way more erotically charged than fully naked, right?
Right.
Just even at just sort of a reactive level, precisely because that.
Because it invites participation, right? Because it invites participation into the process of the unconcealment.
Yes, exactly.
There's nothing, right? Like the fully naked body invites very little participation. The only participation it can possibly invite is the participation of a thing, the participation unto an object. Yeah. And a semi-clothed body invites participation into it invites participation into a poetic process of making the person by the process of revealing the person, right? Again, it reminds me of the sort of in the Neoplatonic metaphysics that somehow the procession, the procession of the one into becoming the many is for the participation of the cosmogenesis, right? It's for the participation. It's so that the many actually symbolically cohere to participate in the creation of the world that proceeds out from the one, if I've understood that correctly. So, it I think it does come back in some sense to it comes back to the participation that ameliorates the erotic encounter from the subject-object metaphysics that otherwise estranges it, I think.
So wouldn't it be the case, I mean, I agree with everything you said, that the naked body, if the naked body is still before us, or even just being sort of acted upon, but if it's, I want to say something like when a person is fully embodied, when you're with the naked other, right? The body can be, again, an invitation to participation if the body becomes, instead of, as you said, an object, if it instead becomes, and I mean this in a complimentary way, symbolic. If the body totally. If the body is a way
or something too, right?
Yeah.
There's a transparency between the two, or translucency, or I don't know what, but where you lose the one and you also lose the many, you're kind of there's not one, not two, as they say in Zen or something like that.
Yes,
that's right.
You become not one, not two. You become non-dual.
It's like the whole expression
comes to fruition in a child. I mean, it's literally the case in the child. The two become one in the child, right?
That's right.
And again, Plato picks up on
that
machinery is there, and we should celebrate it. And I think a little bit more than Plato does. But we should also realize that it's an exaptive potential for us to use that machinery to see aspects of reality that are disclosed by it.
In a theurgic way. Even.
Yes. Yes.
Right.
Exactly.
Like think of the old expression of the body being a temple, right? People deride that expression all the time because they see it as an expression of stringent conservatism or something like that. But it's not, right? Think of all that is implied by that analogy, right? Think of like all of the spiritual exploration that is implied by that analogy.
And the sense of reverence.
And worship, in a sense, we're back to worship. It's like it's a microcosm of worship, of greater things, and that's missing in just the one-on-one kind of encounter.
Yeah, I mean, I hadn't thought about this before. There's a sense in which, for all of the gifts it gives us, the metaphor of touch can also mislead us, because in physical touch, there's a sense in which it comes to the point where it can go no further. And so
that's what Chris was saying in our last conversation about how just sex, right? It's just like almost nothing, right? If it's just sex, in a sense, there's another dimension that has to be present for it to be something real.
I'm trying to. This is like happening right now. I'm trying to figure it out. I'm trying to get something you said earlier about the virtuosity of touch. There's a way of touch, because Han also complains about the aesthetics of the smooth, where we touch things and they're smooth and we stay on the surface. There's a danger of superficiality in touch, and that means we have to see something else going on. And I'm asking this question: what else is going on so that touch is not superficial? Right. And Chris, go.
Well, I don't know. It just, the way I think about it is that it's the difference between touching and touching through, just like it's the difference between seeing and seeing through, right? The touch, if the touch is a symbolic act, what you're touching is not simply the body, right? What you're touching is the spirit and all that it compasses in its own appetite, right? In its own in its own more fundamental orientation, right? So the symbolic touch, the symbolic touch is like an enigmatic gesture whose full compass is not even known by the intent to touch, right? Whereas the touch of the sexual object is basically fits right into Han's critique, which is it's a foreclosure. It's a foreclosure. It doesn't
say enigmatic gesture that's a very interesting. To me, when you said enigmatic gesture, for me that kind of encompasses the erotic act. There's an enigmatic gesture.
But I'm trying to get at, and this is in no way detracting from what you're saying. I'm trying to get at, and there's something in what you said about there's a kind of opacity to transparency shift. You go from looking at to looking through, and so what I'm saying is, this may go back to something we asked earlier. How do we train so our touch isn't superficial pornography, but in depth, right? In depth erotica, ta erotica. Like, we have to practice opacity to transparency shifting. We have to practice, right? Doing that so that when we touch, we don't touch the smooth surface. We're willing to, right? Our touch is extended into it, like you said, the enigmatic gesture towards the less smooth, more challenging, but also more enriching depths. But this is sorry, John, keep going.
No, I was going to say that it occurs to me that the integrated nature of this project was present in the anagogic Eros, not to over-romanticize it or to remove all of its blemishes, of which we know there were, but that the paidetic function of the anagogic Eros that was practiced by Socrates and the Platonic contemporaries in general contained, let's not forget that it contained the sexual element explicitly, right? And so that there was a mentorship, there was a kind of apprenticeship of erotic training and sensitization that included the sexual and the dialogical components that were both unfolded into the erotic
that's
project. And that's one thing. I mean, I don't know how to, this is like a cultural problem. I don't know how to begin proposing a solution to this, but
because it was often older men, older men and younger men,
and younger men, right?
And that's really taboo in our culture these days. But
right. But I guess
that should be a function in our culture as well as other forms of tutelage. I mean,
have you guys seen it?
There's women who teach men how to make love. Like there's an actual tradition of wise women who know how to, who teach. That is a tradition. It's not a very well known tradition or popular tradition, but maybe the Socratic thing is also similar to that in a sense.
That's diatima. I was thinking as you were saying that, Andrew, I was thinking, have you guys seen the film Bill Durham? There's a scene where there's a young buck of a player who's just like horny as all hell, and there's an older woman who he thinks that he's about to get lucky with, and she chains him. I can't remember exactly how it goes, but I think that she ties him to the bed. She sits next to him and she reads him poetry. You know what I mean? Like, again, she traps him, she corners him, she frustrates his sexual impulse, and she uses the frustration. I hope I'm not altering.
I think that's it.
By my memory, but I think it's something like that, right? Yeah. That she basically takes a sexual impulse, she restrains it in order to tutor it. And that's that kind of of course there are all kinds of reasons why that would be taboo. Yeah. But we don't have that kind of encoded erotic mentorship certainly in any broad sense in our culture. And anyway, I'm not saying that that's the solution, but it strikes me as something that perhaps had.
But that kind of thing happens in porn, right? I mean, that kind of thing is repressed and finds itself in perverted forms in other places. So which makes me think that there should be a ritualized form of that in the real culture of some kind. I wouldn't want to guess about or say what that would be, but
well, and it's dangerous because again, that's where people are most vulnerable, and making that an object towards which corporate and political eyes could turn is something that would be fraught with all kinds of risk for abuse.
Which is exactly why these schools are often very secret and hidden away. And
they would have to be, at least in our context, they would have to be. I can't see how they could ever be in any way public.
Because the public in our society will just take whatever and manipulate it and make it a technique and sell it and destroy it in a sense.
Destroy people at their most vulnerable.
Its meaning and destroy people as well. Yeah. So, indeed.
But I'm wondering again if I'm not trying to do sort of Freudian displacement, but I'm wondering about like the intimacy that is fostered in dialogos, and how dialogos is the constant tutorage of doing opacity transparency. What constantly happens in dialogos is you go from looking at to looking through, right? And you're doing again and again and again and again and again and again.
Yeah, what could be more erotic than that? I don't know.
There is a proper, and I hope people are hearing this with a fair and just ear. There is a proper erotic impulse within dialogos and it is, as Chris was suggesting, it is bound up with, like in the seance, it's bound up with our spirituality, it's bound up with our mortality, and it's bound up with this constant practice of doing an opacity to transparency, shifting of attention and awareness in both directions too, by the way, right? You go from looking at yourself to looking through yourself to the ground of yourself, which is not your ego self, right? You go in both directions. At least you have the potential to do that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Because as soon as there is the emergence of a shared identity that exceeds the identities of the participants involved in both forms of that relationship, then the relationship has actually become symbolic, right? But I think there has to be a shared identity that is attained between.
It's funny you said symbolic. I would have thought the opposite. It becomes concrete, or it becomes actual.
But I think,
I know what you
symbolic
mean.
phenomenology involves very concrete action. I don't
sure.
see them as somehow mutually exclusive, right? When I say symbolic, I don't mean completely abstracted or ephemeral. I think it in fact requires embodiment.
Just what do we mean by symbolic? Maybe
I mean, you got to be careful here, and that's what Chris is pointing to.
Yeah.
You have the imaginary symbolic, in which there is something, and it's just right. It's just a like, I'll be Persian here. It's just a mental sign for something beyond itself, right? And we and it, often when you some people say symbolic, they mean it in that sort of cognitive, ornamental sense. But there's the symbolic as the imaginal, right? Where you are acting out, like you're doing serious play, like when the child, puts on a cape and pretends to be Superman. They are actualizing, they're concretely actualizing potential virtues and attitudes and perspectives in themselves.
I see. So it becomes play. It becomes a play.
Yes.
That's
very much.
It's like when you attain to a symbol, when you assume a symbol, it's like your being assumes a pattern of being in the world that exceeds its prior comprehension.
Exactly. Beautifully.
And such your participation in this new perspective exceeds you, or exceeds the boundaries of you as previously conceived, and so you attain the more of yourself in the symbolic process, and that's how it works.
Wow.
So I'm wondering if the trivialization of play in our culture into frivolous entertainment is also contributive to the diminishment of the spiritual potential of the erotic. What came to mind was Hugh Hefner and The Playmate. Well, but that's not right. That's just what I mean. We've trivialized play and we've so denuded it of like what we used to mean when we talked about the serious play of music. And there's a serious play within sexuality, right? That has to be recovered.
Absolutely. Yeah.
It has to be recovered.
Yeah. What I was thinking of actually about that, this is maybe another point, but about the narrative and the post-narrative. So
yes,
I was thinking that when you said symbol, I was thinking narrative. So I was thinking, okay, so often when you meet somebody, there's a narrative leading up to that, and then you enter into a post-narrative state with that person, in a sense. And there's no words for it, or there's no, there's a hidden language, but it's not verbal. It's somatic. It's like all kinds of things. But that's why I stopped you at when you said symbol.
That's really interesting, Andrew, because this idea of sharing a story with someone, and the shared story being this sort of the symbolic adherent to the relationship. And I think what often happens with people who are in relationships for long periods of time is that the relationship begins to lose its erotic vitality when there's no longer a shared story that conjoins a unified identity between the two people, right? So when you start to lose the plot together, when you're no longer sharing of a story that vectors you in a single shoulder to shoulder direction. I think that is a kind of a loss of, I think, the symbolic glue that binds people into erotic relation to one another. So I think you're onto
I can
something
see it
important.
going both ways, because when intimacy deepens, in a sense, then again it becomes sort of post-narrative. But maybe the symbol is the symbolism is still active. It's just more transparent or more.
Sometimes, because the story has to change, right? The narrative, as it were, has to self-transcend, I think, in order for the relationship to continue to self-transcend. Yeah. But sometimes at certain junctures, when faced with the necessity of self-transcendence, a narrative can simply fail rather than to die and regrow.
Yeah.
Right. And so it's like an important either or, I think, that has to happen in some sense. I'm not sure that that's necessary, but it's just, anyway. Yeah.
No, I think that's, I mean, well, Chris, maybe you've seen it, Andrew. I've been sort of pursuing this narrative, post-narrative thing and really trying to think about it, because I want to know, without infinite regress or homuncular explanation, where our capacity to move out of a narrative comes from. And we're back to the emergence, right? There's something, because of course it's almost a trope in couples therapy that the couple has got entrapped in a narrative that is preventing the relationship. It's preventing both of them and the relationship from growing or transforming as it needs to because of developmental change within or contextual change
because
without.
you have a concretized notion of the other person. I'm like this and you're like this.
Yeah, yeah.
We're stuck in this sort of.
You get stuck in a narrative, right?
And you can't remodel it.
Yeah, and family dynamics are famous for narratives where people have their assigned roles, and then once that's all locked in, then the family can't heal, it can't progress. And so
it becomes like a false memory, like a pathologos.
Yes.
Pierre Grimes calls that the pathologos, the false memory that implants itself as a consequence of an idolized narrative.
Yeah.
And I say idolized.
Yeah, that's great.
Pierre Grimes calls it a pathologos.
Yeah.
The belief of the belief that concretizes such that it becomes false for its implacability.
And also because it's in the past, or it's an image, or it's a.
Yeah, I'm supposed to talk with him soon because we share, of course, a deep interest in sort of because he's deeply influenced by Neoplatonism, profoundly so. The pathologos. Yeah, the narrative that becomes like a hardened idol. All right, to use some of our metaphors. So I'm interested. I'm interested in what brings in the liquidity. What is the non-narrative? And I think Dialogos has an important thing to say about that. What is it that allows us, other than the narrative, to realize we are trapped in a narrative? Because as you said, Chris, the narrative has to keep evolving, all right, or if it's going to actually function. And that really intrigues me. The reason I'm saying that, Andrew, is I'm trying to make us place in the conversation for what you said, the non-narrative.
We have to break the pattern. You have to break. There's something
right.
That has,
but what is
some negative
that does that?
I'm thinking of the Hegelian negativity or something, but there has to be a negative. There has to be something that breaks the pattern somehow.
But it can't be just pain. Because people will stay. It can't just be right. It's not a simplistic sort of Piagetian thing. Because people will stay in these painful narratives for decades. It's not just that things are going bad. It's not enough, right? And I'm sorry, I don't mean to get so frightened, but there's something else. There's a positive drive other than narrative, because the pain is often insufficient. There's something else. And it strikes me that that we're getting to get to the core of the Eros, because it's something that takes the lack. There's something lacking in this narrative and drives me beyond it in a positive way.
Yeah, in a positive way. Yeah. Because it's unbearable at a certain point. But then you kind of break through it, but also I guess you could change in a more subtle way.
But I think
you're walking in one direction, you decide to go the other direction at one.
Paranoia. Yeah.
Just very, very.
There's something about, again, about the hunger gets transmuted into a receptivity that affords the emanation of that which is beyond the scope of the narrative, right? That you basically. Right, you convert the hole that is your hunger into an aperture through which another world can shine. Something like that has to happen.
That's really good, and that is a fundamental. That's really well put, John. That's a fundamentally existential move.
Yes.
Fundamentally existential move, right? And that's where that whole line of thinking, that whole side of philosophy, I think, can inject itself also.
Yes.
Its utility injects into this conversation right there at that juncture, right? Because the disposing of oneself in order to be known is precisely the existential decision that lays one open to the power of being and the power of revival, right? I think of that almost in a Nietzschean way.
Yeah, that's right.
So like Camus, who says like you have a choice between committing suicide or having a cup of coffee in the morning, it's like
but there's also Camus when he says, and I've quoted this before, I want to learn how to be a saint without God. That's the entire problem I'm up against. Like, where is that impulse coming from is what I keep coming back to again and again and again.
Well,
that's
from
an
God,
erotic
no?
impulse.
I mean, it's a sort of, you would think that it would have to come from something beyond Camus.
It does, but that's exactly the point. And what is it? Is it Tartuffe? What's the name of the character? Tartuffe? The character in the Plague. He's basically, the problem he's facing is he needs that which is outside that can, as Chris says, know him, but God isn't a possibility for him. But he still nevertheless wants to be called the way the saint is called. He wants to be called beyond himself. And so, but I want to know, like, well, I mean, I've tried answering it myself, but as you can see, maybe this is erotically charged. I find the answers I've given, while perhaps helpful to myself and others, I find them inadequate. I keep coming back to, and this is this is.
What about enjoyment? I was thinking about the cup of coffee. Is that not enough? Is that not like something, or at least no, it's too small?
There's something.
Because there's kind of a problem with enjoyment with the existentialists. They don't believe in it or something. They're kind of afraid to be happy, or they're kind of angry about existence. Or I always get the sense like, anyway, maybe I'm making a caricature here.
No, but the problem is the word enjoyment is equivocal between pleasure and joy, where joy is precisely the thing that we're seeking. We're seeking, joy means to be in contact with something that is profoundly good, profoundly real.
Like what I was thinking about is, Proust and his his little
Madeleine. Yeah.
His Madeleine, or I guess Camus and his coffee, or just sort of this kind of, a glimpse of eternity in the simple things, or.
That's a possibility. I hadn't thought about it that way. But again, so, okay, then.
I mean, in actual things, not just in spiritual escapism or something like that,
But then again, this is Spinoza's question, perhaps, or at least I hear Spinoza saying it. You're saying we have a hunger for eternity. And this is the Platonic question. You see it all. That's why we come up with the theory of recollection and all these implausible accounts. I'm really interested in, where does that come from, and how do we recognize it well? I'm trying to, because if we answer those questions, we can discern the hunger for eternity and perhaps better transmute it into the receptivity for eternity. That's what's driving me right now.
It's kind of almost like a koan, isn't it? It's not something like you want to give a trite answer to when you ask that question.
No, the value of the question lies in its being a question.
Thank you guys for indulging me and letting me voice that, because voicing that was important for me. Thank you.
Because we have at our disposal, even in this conversation, we have metaphysics that account for that question, John. But I think perhaps if I can understand the real valence of your question, it's that I think of the Neoplatonic metaphysics, right? The procession, we has an answer for that question, right? It's the procession from the one is precisely the answer to that question. And all of the Christian permutations of Neoplatonism, of course, seize that and pick it up and carry it forward. But I think implicit to your question is the secondary question. This does not function for me now.
Yes.
How now must we think of this procession? Yes. How now must we think of the source of the want for eternity, if not from the procession from the Godhead?
That's amazing, God. Because we could get caught in some sort of, again, it's like what we're talking about with having a story, having a narrative and all that. And it's sort of a bit like that. It's like, because everything is a process, right? Even, Buddha is not some final thing. It's a process, or whatever is a process. So we have to situate ourselves in the process rather than in some sort of conclusion or some sort of, I guess, philosophical proposition.
I think that's right. I think what the process and the transnarrative and the metaphysics, while beautiful and even helpful, intelligibly helpful, or helpfully intelligible. That it's the function question, and that's maybe why I cited that character, because I don't know how to do that, right? And because there's a degradation of the realization of the hunger for eternity into the narrative of immortality. And that's ancient. That goes back to Gilgamesh, right? The fundamental mistake of misunderstanding. And that's why of misunderstanding the hunger for eternity as the quest for immortality. And that's what the Buddhist tradition on this point, I think, is much better than the Christian tradition, because the Buddhist tradition says, yes, I get it. You're horrified by your mortality. But look, immortality is also horrifying. It's really, really horrifying. right? And the idea is you're supposed to stereoscopically see between those two horrors so that you realize that what you're talking about, right, is this hunger for eternity, which is not the hunger for immortality, the escape from mortality. And that to me, yeah, that like where do we have the place where we can step away from all of that heritage, the heritage of immortality, and recover the discernment, the proper, appropriate discernment of the hunger for eternity that can be transmuted into a reception of the divine? Yes.
Yeah, that shakes me up. Your question. I can feel myself trembling on the inside. Yeah.
And I think it's the same question. I think fundamentally, the identity of that question shares identity with the question of where, oh, where in the world is the locus, the true locus of Eros.
Yeah.
Because in order for Eros, this is a point that I think Lewis makes this point actually very well, that one of the things that distinguishes Eros, separates it categorically from mere sexuality, is that its source and locus is not within the individual.
Yeah.
The individual participates in it, but it's not located in the individual, just like the appetite for eternity, the longing for eternity cannot originate in the decision of the individual. The decision of the individual has to encounter and interact with that fundamental drive, but the drive does not.
It's almost like you didn't ask to be born or something. Like
that's right. That's right.
We didn't ask to be here and confronting all this, and it was not something we asked for. But
yeah, you're right. I hear Kierkegaard in your voice, Chris. It's like you have to be called, because anything other than a call is not what we're talking about.
Right. Right. And I think one of the I don't know if it was Iamblichus or who it was, but I think they described it in exactly those terms. They describe it as a call. I don't know if it's Porphyry or Iamblichus, but one of them describes Eros specifically in those terms.
And that's the distinction also between theurgia and sorcery. Sorcery is the pejorative term, because sorcery is applied to make the gods do things, where theurgia is the work of the gods. It's right in the term. You're supposed to, the most you can do is cultivate the appropriate receptivity, so that and that means like comprehensively through your entire being, so that a space is afforded in which the gods can act. Yeah, I think that's right.
To which you can hear the call.
Yeah. To the call. Yeah, and that's why Eckhart talks about like giving birth, right? You can't give birth to the Son of God. What you can do is you can become receptive to that. But of course, that has its downsides too, because then that can become this self-negating kind of spirituality, where the whole point of spirituality is to negate the self.
Well, when you hear the call, you have to, not just passively listen to the call, and that's part of it. You let it shake you up and stuff, but then,
But I've been touched by people who I care about deeply, who have been, I think, in a complete existential authenticity, and I think this is true of me to some degree too, have been waiting or awaiting the call, and they suffer. So, I mean, there's a price to be paid for the fact that there's a mystery to this, which is some people, wait for a very long time. I imagine, I don't know this, and I don't want to make any pronouncements on it, but maybe there are people that wait their whole lives. And what does that mean? What does that mean? I mean, we have to get a spirituality that can encompass that possibility, rather than what Christianity seemed to promise, which was everybody is going to be redeemed if they wish to be. Anyways, I'm just thinking about the fact that there's a possibility. I'm not saying an inevitability or probability, but there's a possibility that our love for eternity might be unrequited in some fashion. And we need to perhaps also educate ourselves to have an appropriate compassion for people who are suffering that to whatever degree of temporal duration that it has. They need a kind of care that's analogous to, you can only properly share someone's grief if you've also lost in a way that's irretrievable to you, right? And we need to be like, you can't really share someone's grief unless you have lost, and you can't, and you irretrievably. We need to have that kind of care for people. And I'm not excluding myself. I'm not putting myself.
And we don't lose that grief either.
No, we don't. And
the grief kind of remains and sort of. So it's yeah.
It becomes at the tenor of your life in certain ways. But what I'm saying, I don't think. And one thing we should talk about, we maybe want to do it triologos about. Our culture has not properly grieved the death of God. That's part of what's going on right now. We have not properly, responsively, and thoroughly grieved the death of God. Wow. So but I'm using that also as an analogy for people who want to be called by God, but have not heard his or her voice, and how, like, we need to care about that, and we need to care for people who are undergoing that with the same kind of love that we can express when we express shared grief, the capacity to have experienced grief. Because I think we all have, at least to varying degrees, we all fall short of the glory of God, right? So.
Geez, John. It's by analogy, it's like the grief that you're talking about is just on a different scale, just to bring us back to.
Well, I was thinking of calling it aspirational grief.
It's the grief of the lost love. True, it's the grief of the lost love.
Grief of the lost love.
It's the same. It's the grief for the possibility.
Yeah, that's what I meant when I was trying to suggest aspirational love.
Yeah, that's right. Grief. Aspirational grief for the possibility.
Yeah.
That was provided by the requited comprehension of the knowing lover.
Yeah.
And that same a version of a fundamental version of that grief, I think, is what you're talking about, John.
Yes, there is. There's a grief for the future self in relation to the depths of reality that never was fully birthed, right?
Yeah.
And not because of vice, or not because of neglect. Those are different things, and they need to be addressed. I'm not denying them, but I think, I think reality. This was in existentialism. There's an aspect of reality that is deeply indifferent to human concerns, or it wouldn't be reality, and that can impact on people who are waiting to be called by the sacred. In a way that can be very, very harsh to them.
That gives me an incredible insight into your entire mission, John, in a sense, or what I would like my mission to be, but fall short of that in a sense. I don't know how to say that, but
I think that's right, Andrew.
Extremely touching.
Well, thank you. But it's because of this dialogos that I was able to articulate it. I hadn't quite seen it that way before. I think you're right. I think now retrospectively, that is a good way to characterize my project. But yeah.
The compassion of it. Drive and compassion of it.
Very much. I should go soon, guys. I have to meet with my sons. I'm kind of reticent to say anything more right now too. I just want to sort of stay in this space a bit. So I want to thank you guys for this, and I'm always happy, and I look forward to being able to do this again.
Me too. Thanks so much, guys.
Likewise.
Take care, my friends. Take good care.
Thanks, guys. Indeed.